Thank you very much. Yes, my name is Victor. I'm engineer at EPAM. Also, I'm coordinator for Rolling Scope School. So if someone wants to start LearnJS, come to me. I will tell you how. And idea of my presentation is GraphQL. Tell me, is there anyone who have a strong knowledge in GraphQL, used it widely? Yes, no one will see my mistakes. Okay, actually, I'm not so good at the presentation. That's why we start talking on this screen. What is GraphQL? First of all, when people see this, they starting to think about SQL and query languages and databases. Actually, it's a bit about databases, but not. And it has nothing about graphs, like at all. GraphQL is actually a new way of API which was developed internally by Facebook. They used GraphQL for their pet projects like Facebook, Instagram, and that's all. And later on they decided to make it public. The GraphQL, usually, what is this about? It's query language. It's how we can structure our API. So we know REST. I think every one of you know REST. So GraphQL is the other way of thinking. It's the way you make your endpoints in REST usually is you creating endpoints. You create the places where your front end goes and take its data. So when we create API with REST, we usually think about where we will take data. But in GraphQL, we don't think about where, we think about what data do we need. So actually, we just think about data. So it's a bit small example. So for example, we have REST endpoint users, and from here we can take an array of our users like name, last name, age, and 25 more properties. Sometimes we don't need. And in GraphQL, you don't go to dash users. You don't go to some place. You just tell your backend that I need users and I need their names and last names. And actually, GraphQL server will return you only name, last names, and that's all. He will bring you what you asked for. And that's the thing how GraphQL works on top. First of all, GraphQL is more client-driven architecture. Why? Because your client, your front end decides what it needs. It tells to your endpoint, to your server, and he will give you data. In REST, we are more server-driven because we actually create endpoints. So for example, for user, we can have like 10, 12, 100 endpoints only for user, just to take data about users. So they are more server-driven. Also, we have a few more points, like, for example, operations. In REST, we have 4 standard operations: create, read, update, delete. They are standard for us, but GraphQL decided to a bit smaller make them. So we have query and mutation. Actually, query is more about like read data. Mutation is create, update, and delete in complex. And also they have the other operation which calls subscription. It's a bit more complex operation, but it's about subscription of your client to your server side. Also, how we organize our endpoint. In REST, we create endpoints. In GraphQL, we have schemas and types. So actually, we have one endpoint, only one, and we only describe what data we have. So we describe our users, our, projects, books, and everything else. But as we can see when we fetch data, so we can, as I told before, we get specific data from the one API, so from one single endpoint. But in REST, we have like multiple API calls, multiple endpoints, like hundreds, thousands of them. Also, about something I want to take. I don't want to take them all. I want to take something that is really important is performance. So actually, it's very fast because we have we get data and we can get smaller pieces of data from our GraphQL server, because as I shown on first slide, we can get users with 24 properties we don't need. In GraphQL, we can get only last name and name if we need. If you want, we can get only name, and we get less data, so we spend less time to get it. So also, it's a bit difficult to learn GraphQL, but I don't think so. Actually, you just need to change the way you think. So when you do your endpoints with REST, you usually think like, okay, I need users, you create your endpoint, you create your servers, you get data. But when you started to think like, not about how to give information, but about how your user is. So you're just thinking about user, about his model, about his structure. It becomes easier to learn GraphQL, but it still has features which are not presented in REST, which are not presented in Express, for example, and you have to learn them there. The great minus of GraphQL actually is that it doesn't work with files like at all. So we can transfer files, we can transfer only data, but you still can fix it with like AWS Lambdas and everything else, and put the endpoint in REST, which will give you files like this. And also the problem of it is web caching. As we all know, we can, our browsers, they cache data, but we don't have it at all in GraphQL because we have only one endpoint, so it's not about caching. In REST we have it, but in GraphQL you can cache, of course, on backend side or some third-party libraries in in your application yourself. So you have to think about cache by yourself. So let's talk about GraphQL. So as I told, we are thinking about types. So I presented two different ways. Yeah, because I lost one slide. Give me a second, please. Yeah. So in GraphQL, we have a few tools. I want to mention especially GraphQL tools and Apollo. GraphQL tools is a set of tools for your Express application, actually, yes. So they they just helps you to create GraphQL-driven types and definitions on non-Apollo servers like Express. And Apollo is completely GraphQL-driven libraries for front-end and back-end. So actually they are designed also by Facebook. So it's Apollo server, it's some React libraries, some Angular libraries, which can help you to work with GraphQL. So that's why when I decided to switch, so I decided to place two different ways. So left one on this screen is how Apollo types works and how it works with GraphQL libraries. Yeah, so in Just.js with Express, you can see that we just create a type. We create user, we give him a name, we give fields like ID or email. We decide which type will it be. So GraphQL have its own types like integer, string, and boolean, and everything else. And also we can create some kind of resolvers. So they will, like, if you have if you receive data from database and you have user underscore email and you want to turn it in email inside your model, you just resolve it by this. And the same thing we can do in Apollo servers. So we create just type, book, name, author. So they looks a bit easier because, as I told, Apollo is completely GraphQL driven, and that's why it takes less code to just explain how your types looks. That's about types. Next thing is queries. Queries, as I told before, is like get in REST, so it's completely a get method. So you also just create your type query, you create fields. So for examples, we have product in Apollo, yeah, so we decide what arguments it will have, like ID should be integer and it will return the product. The same we can create in plain JavaScript, like users. We have type, so it means that our query should return list of users, and we create resolver for it. So a small callback to our database, which should return user list. So that's how query works. So imagine a small get endpoint, and actually we don't have any services or something like that. We just place our query, we place your name and fields, and place resolvers inside it. So we think about models, not about something else. And mutations. As I told before, mutations is like update, delete operations, create, update, delete operations. So they are all named like mutations in GraphQL. So the point of them is to change your data inside your database. So you can see a small on the left, on left picture, I think is better. You can see like we create mutation, like always we create user. So it means that we gonna go to our GraphQL with user, and it will just take arguments. We just define which type it will be, and we create a resolver which actually will change our data inside our database and return our new user. So a bit more about resolvers. So resolvers, it's actually a function which you can think in Express or REST is like a service. So it's a function which takes some arguments and returns you data. So in GraphQL, every resolver has its own four different arguments. So first of all, it has first argument is parent. So actually, it returns value of the resolver of field's parent value. So yeah, in GraphQL, you can nest your queries, like for example users, then you get like from users you want to get his books, from books you want to get his authors, and you just can nest inside each other your models. So in this case we need for resolver, for example, how our parent worked for now. Also you can get your arguments which you get from which user on client decided to place. So for example, like a new ID for user or new name for user which you wanted to update. Also it gets context. Context is more about metadata which you get from across all resolvers. It's shared, and it's like authentication and something else, some other information which you need maybe in your resolver. And also you have info. It's a force parameter. It's really rare to use, but it gets it gives you information about all your operation state execution. So you can get its complete metadata of all your requests of your query, and maybe it can be useful for you. So some people use it, and I will even some third-party libraries, like for example Join Monster, is using info just to, for example, get your GraphQL query and transform it inside the SQL query for usage. Just maybe if you don't want to create SQL or write SQL by yourself, you can use some library. It will take info, parse it to SQL, and go to database. And the last, not last, but very interesting thing is about how endpoint works. So yeah, it's actually not very much. We just create one endpoint. We create a schema which actually has a description. So in top we can see like it takes query, it takes your type definitions, takes your resolvers, takes everything you created, all models you created for queries, for mutations, types itself, and it creates schema and then make it public, so creates a server for you. And how it works on client side, actually not very, it's really easy because you have only one endpoint. So for example, simple curl you can use without any libraries, like you just need to create a post a post request to your endpoint which you created, and just create a small string. So all queries in GraphQL is a string. So we create like query. It means that we want to get some data from query. We want users, name, last name. In Apollo clients, as I told before, Apollo have some additional libraries for React, for Angular and else. So as a React developer, I decided to show you React example. So it has like a small hook, which so you create your string with GraphQL client, you create query, get users, and then you just use hook, and he will send the data to the database. And about basics, that's actually all. So I decided not to drive too deep. So maybe you have questions, and I hopefully can ask them.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting as well. And I have many questions.
Hopefully I can answer them.
Because, well, obviously it was very high level. And so first of all, in the beginning, you had a slide.
I can show you slides, yeah.
The slide with the comparison was
Yep.
this one. So about stability here, you didn't mention better choice for complex queries is the REST. So the GraphQL doesn't cannot just the question is, can we just switch from REST to GraphQL for any application because we hear is cool, or are there any real reasons not to switch to GraphQL?
Actually, yes, if you have some. So GraphQL is more about data-driven. So if your application is about getting data from database and pull it to client side, so GraphQL will be good for it because it's like a small layer between your client and the database. And the reason why, for example, it doesn't work with files at all, yeah, so it works only with data. And if you have really strong, really I don't know, spaghetti data or very complex data, so it possibly could be not good, but you still can create your types, you still can create your schemas, and you still can but it will just take you, I think, more efforts for creating infrastructure for it, to create all the types, to link them between each other and everything else. And sometimes, yeah, it can be better choice to use REST, but actually the thing why I mentioned that you can use not only Apollo server, you can use your Express servers. So you actually can create, like in Express, separate small endpoint with GraphQL, and your application will go to this layer for your data. And in the same server, you can, because it's Express, you can use the simple REST endpoints for some really complex tasks, for something which is really complex, and they will work with this. They will.
Nice. So you can actually use both at the same time. That's also
yes, actually, yes, you can.
And so if I understand correctly, because for REST we usually need the API layer. We need the backend with the databases, the API to send us to the UI the code. And here with the GraphQL, we just talk directly to the database?
No, you still need a layer. Actually, I even have, so for example, we have a database. So it's the same, just think about resolve function. It is like a service which goes to database, get data, and returns back. So resolvers itself, it's a functions of GraphQL which works actually with data and returns it back. But you still need to think about that. If you wanted to mutate your user, your resolver should return user type and nothing else. So that's some GraphQL maybe limitations, but they strongly want you to work with typing. So if you want to mutate user, you want to return user, you don't want it to return book. And that's why you have to think about these things.
Sorry, so this side is not on the client? It's
Yes, it's backend side. It's all backend side.
It's on the back.
Actually, on client side, it's only one thing. So you create only like query, get user, and you describe what data you need. Or for example, you create mutation, update user, and you like user ID and send it. So your queries on client side looks like this, and all the other things is actually backend side.
So basically, in order to implement this approach for the project, the most of the effort lies on the backend team, so to say.
Yeah. So it's many efforts from backend, and it's really makes life easier for client because your front-end team can just send requests for data, so they don't need your explanation. Like, for example, this endpoint, he returns this data, this endpoint, this data. You just make a query like, I need users and books. That's all, and your endpoint will give you users and books.
All the complexity goes to backend.
Yes. All the complexity goes to backend, and backend have to think a bit different, not like with endpoints, with not extend endpoints or something. They works with models itself.
Nice. Thank you very much. I'll give you an opportunity to ask somebody else.
Yeah, it's actually a good question. So yeah, thank you.
Sorry. Yeah. 1, 2, 3, check. So thank you once again for the great presentation. I just wanted to add maybe some discussion about the complexity. Let me summarize. So the GraphQL gives us an opportunity to actually select what we want, right, with actually specifying the fields. Plus, we are creating some kind of validation of the requests. Yes?
Yeah.
Is there something more?
I think it could be more things, but I decided to talk about basics. So yeah, but actually, yeah. So the thing is, GraphQL is about getting your JSON objects. So about getting your data. So that's what it works with.
Yeah, and how do you usually solve that to client? Because for me, it looks like you just adding the complexity just for some cool stuff, but in other hands, we can go with queries.
Yeah, actually, so for example, if your application is really complex, just imagine why Facebook decided to create this. I think they had some issues with their own backend, yes? So if you have a really big data structures and you work with like thousands of endpoints, for example, for only user, and it becomes more and more complex, and when you need some more endpoint for user, it just breaks you apart and breaks your front-end team, which just have to take in mind all of this. So this one, he doesn't you never think where you have to go. You just it's like, yeah, I don't have to go anywhere, I just want this. And it's this approach is to make life easier when you have like a data layer, but it's pretty big different requests for your data. So it makes it easier.
But it looks like it's just some new pattern that people need to learn. So it's additional complexity and cost. And besides of that, people can just go with what they already know, right? But they will just have more flexibility. So why do we need it? Sorry for this question.
Yeah, it's actually a good question, but so sometimes, yes, you can work like it worked before, but your documentation becomes more and more important. So first of all, so let's take, yeah, so you have user, you need like to add some parameters. So you want to get some user or some posts of this user, and also, for example, some author of the post of the user. So you can go deeply and deeply and deeply. Your endpoint become like 50, I don't know, maybe 100 string lengths. Yeah. So, and you can, and later on, your post, your author becomes some more complex structure, and you will go, you get dashes, and between, and you go deeper and deeper inside your author, but still connected to a user. So it just gives you some more representative state, so you can put your user inside, get something else, and it makes your project more structured and more or less, I don't know, more organized, and it's really becomes easier to work with it. But if you have system, you already have like Express server, and you want to move to GraphQL, so it doesn't mean you need to like rework everything. You can just start with some little pieces and rework them. So for example, if your system have everything good with users, but your some data layer is really big, you can just, okay, I want to create dash books for my, and make it as GraphQL, and take a little piece of your backend to GraphQL, and it will just look more better and more clarifying. For
I guess to summarize that, we can just mark that less flexibility gives you less amount of errors. And
yes,
right?
Okay, yeah. I just trying to think to explain, and yeah, maybe.
Yeah, you did right. Thank you.
And also, it's about typing, because it gives you cannot, for example, return book when you ask for users. So yeah, it's strong typing, and it's really good.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. My name is Slava, and I have a really short question. It is about the table that you showed before, and there was no security option there. So is there any security difference between GraphQL and REST?
If there are, I didn't even found any for now, actually. So when I worked with it, so for security layer, it's still the same, because actually it's just the way you are create your API. So it still have some difference between in other cases like caching or something else. Yeah. So, but in security, I didn't found any difference. Maybe it's my bad that I didn't found any. So they're still the same. You still have authentication layer. You still have something similar to middlewares, which works in Express, for example. So you can put a layer for authentication. You can put a layer for any other checks. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Andrei, and I wanted to ask, is this approach specific for Node.js serverization, or I can use it with some other languages? Is there realizations for Java or Python, for example?
Yes, you can use it. I think I even have seen that Apollo server, for example, it has servers for C++, and I think for Java too, I have seen it. So I think yes, if I remember right.
Thank you. And the other question is also about security. Maybe I just thought maybe there could some issues with data restriction. Maybe you should think more with this approach, which data is restricted for each user. Is there issues like this with Apollo?
Which data any user can get? So you mean authentication levels? So for example, me as a small user, I can get data about I don't know which you're thinking about. Permission levels or something like this. Yeah, for sure. You still have your context. You still can create. We just didn't talk about it because I decided to talk about some basically. But yeah, you still have a layer of for authentication of checking for which data you can get to anyone. So your endpoint still can be secured. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yep.
Hello, thank you for presentation. I want to add something about permissions. You asked about permissions. I had experience with GraphQL back in 2019, and I have to say that there's no difference between REST and GraphQL about permissions, because when you work with REST, you, for example, add some headers to requests, and when you work with GraphQL, you too add some headers in request. And permissions and authentications is actually technology agnostic. You can use same methodic for REST and same methodic for GraphQL. There is no difference. And you asked about is it only for JavaScript? I'm developed GraphQL server on PHP a few years ago, and it works awesome. I really recommend to touch GraphQL. And I have another question for you. We talked about performance issues with GraphQL. That's obvious that multiple network calls take up more time than just a single request to the GraphQL. But what about performance in the backend? It's really, from my experience, it's really hard to trace which data in which combinations will be called from front end to server, and you should. And from my experience, I'm observed most common data structures and optimize it in the request request answer algorithm, because it's pretty hard to maintain all of that data structure that front end can possible request from the server.
I think I understood you. It's about nesting. So when you have like something inside something, inside something, inside something. So yeah, it can be, it will, of course, it will take more time, because actually when you create your queries, so give me a second. Yeah, so when you create your query, so for example, query for user, yeah, so you create its fields and resolvers. And later on you want to create your, you will create your own type, for example, named books, and it will contain all resolvers for books. And then you create like I don't know, authors. And actually, if you query your backend like users, and I want books of these users, and I need like authors of these books, so they will go. So first, it will go to the users, it will get users, then it will run query for books and take user as a parent, then it will run authors and take book as a parent. So yeah, it will take more time. So sometimes you just, actually, if you want optimizations, you just maybe need to rethink your query, for example. Yeah, so you just not going for, you first get users, then you decide which user you want, then get his books and everything else, if it hits your performance much. But usually in nesting, sometimes maybe you really need to think about creating one more type if you're going deep down in nesting between each other. So maybe it needs to think once more about schema, think once more about the type you created. So maybe it's too difficult and too difficult, and maybe you can create it a bit easy in a bit easier way and restructure it somehow. So sometimes we meet some such things when we work with TypeScript itself. Yeah, so it's actually a good example, because everyone, I think, heard about TypeScript. So when we create like really nested and very complex interfaces, it becomes complicated too. And the GraphQL is the same thing. So sometimes we just need to restructure.
So essentially, on the server, you can't predict where the issues will start appearing. Then, as soon as they start appearing, you have to restructure the front-end code and the back-end code permanently, right?
No, actually, you need to think. Maybe you want. You need to decide. Maybe you go to your front end and tell them, "Hey, guys, please be patient. Don't nest too much." Or maybe they will tell you that I'm sorry, we don't have time. So you guys on backend just work harder, and they will.
The simplicity of the set of GraphQL processes is disappearing now, right? As soon as the backend guys come and tell me, hey, your front-end code is causing my backend code to die, you need to restructure your front-end code so the simplicity of the code disappears.
It doesn't disappear. It's just it's still simple, but people can create simple things complex. They like such stuff. So sometimes, yeah, you can. I don't know, maybe some new guy come to you and he decided, so wow, I can get, I don't know, 10 levels nested data, but he decided not to go to this data, but he decided to create all 10 levels query for it. You still can have such queries in your REST API when the guy, instead of using one endpoint, decided to use 10 of your endpoints, and you will still come to him and tell you, hey, why do you need 9 other endpoints? Please remove them.
I want to add something. It's what about I want to warn the community about this complexity. And when you work with GraphQL, please think twice about which data in which combination you allow to request from front end, because it will be hard to ask front end team to not to use this field or not. Yes, not to combine. And another issue with GraphQL is in REST API you have version control. You can set this REST version is version 1, version 2, but in GraphQL you just can't versionize this GraphQL. You can deprecate some fields, but you can deprecate combination of fields, or you can deprecate nesting of some fields. So GraphQL needs to be perfectly planned before given to the front-end team.
Yeah, and I want to add, actually, the thing that GraphQL have no version in people from GraphQL telling that it's the strong thing from them, because it's cool, we don't have version and you don't need versions, you just use it and it works. And
and by the way, I want to add that Facebook itself use GraphQL to the main page, on the main page, on the feed of Facebook. Facebook team use GraphQL, and they had YouTube video about how they implement that, and they have no problems with performance. They just plant and architecture it, they GraphQL cleaned, optimized for front-end teams. So I want anyone to try GraphQL, but think twice when you planning how data will flow to front end. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, I want to add a bit a small comparison, we told about Express and Nest as frameworks for Node.js. Yes, so for example, Express is still functional way, but Nest is really close to GraphQL in comparison, because it also object-oriented. It's still so it's the same thing, because you need to think very strong about the types. So it's really the type. I forgot how typization will be. So so it's really need your types, and you need to think about the types, about definition of your types, and in the other way, Nest will pull you out very fast, because he really is all about thinking about the way you architecture your application. So in Express, actually, you just can create endpoint and do services, and you can never even refactor your services. You just can create another one endpoint and pull the code here. So it will work, but it never will work in GraphQL. Yeah.